My guest is Robert Mazur, the DEA undercover agent and also author of the book, The Infiltrator, My Secret Life Inside the Dirty Banks Behind Pablo Escobar's Metal and Cartel. Bob, it's been a while since we've had you on, but it's great to speak with you once again.
Thank you very much for inviting me back.
Before we start talking about what's going on in Colorado, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, just kind of to reintroduce yourself to listeners and your background?
Sure. I was a federal agent for 27 years, and during that time, principally I worked on cases trying to identify and prosecute the command and control of the Colombian cartels, and initially did that from the traditional sense of search warrants and wiretaps and informants, but ultimately the group that I was working with came to the conclusion that the best approach we could take would be a long-term undercover operation, a long-term undercover money laundering operation that would enable us to infiltrate the money flows which would take us to the command and control. So I volunteered to be a long-term undercover agent. I went through undercover agent training. I spent about a year and a half after that putting together what I think is one of the more sophisticated fronts that's been used in long-term undercover. I emerged from that with a completely new identity, embedded in real businesses, an investment company, mortgage brokerage business. We had an air charter service with a private jet, a jewelry chain with 70 locations on the East Coast, and even a brokerage firm with a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. So I was a part of a team. I was the, I guess, for lack of a better term, the quarterback on the team, but we succeeded, I think, in this operation because we were a team, and by no means am I an individual hero in this thing. I'm not a hero at all. I'm just a person who had the opportunity to assume those roles, and it took me on a ride that is, I think, pretty unique. For 2 years, I dealt with a lot of people who were direct reports to Pablo Escobar. I became a money launderer for them. I became a conduit for them to what was the seventh largest privately held bank in the world, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. And I wound up dealing with board members levels of the bank. The bank was in 72 countries, had more than 500 branches, and had an insatiable appetite for taking in deposits from the underworld. And so our case ended with the prosecution of about 100 drug traffickers and money launderers, bank officers, and the demise of the bank.
What's the biggest takeaway people are going to get when they read your book, The Infiltrator?
I think a stunning look at the fact that there is, unfortunately, a segment of the international banking community that, to this very day, markets the underworld and provides services to them to transform the literally $400 billion a year generated from the sale of illegal drugs into the legal world, where they can compete at a very, very difficult level for honest businessmen to compete with, and how we have not just the international banking community involved. I think my involvement in the international banking community found me in a crossroads between the drug world, the intelligence community, and unfortunately, corruption. And there were a lot of individuals from many different countries who were involved with BCCI, who were political leaders who were using the bank for the same type of services. So, and also terrorists using the bank for those types of services. So it's a story really that gives the public a bird's eye view of what it's like at the highest levels of the drug world, and how it interfaces with the international banking and business community.
This week is the first week of legalized marijuana in the state of Colorado. It has started off with a very rocky start. What can you tell us about it, and how are the cartels reacting to this week in Colorado?
Well, I think that there are, and you're right, it's a very rocky start for the legal shop owners who are providing legal marijuana in personal consumption amounts to the public. You've got to recognize that they are now taking over the distribution of what was an illegal drug from transnational criminal organizations. And there's no doubt in my mind that, especially because of the unbelievable pricing that has happened, supply and demand has forced the prices way up, that there are a number of things that are probably right around the corner in Colorado that need to be watched. One, I think that the criminal organizations that have controlled that business there are going to find themselves with an opportunity to establish a black market, because the pricing is so high in the legal market that it leaves plenty of room for the black market to continue to sell to consumers. Secondly, there is a mass confusion within the banking community about how they can deal with legal marijuana distributors in the state of Colorado when, on a national level, the federal government still classifies marijuana as a Schedule I drug, meaning that it is highly addictive, it's hallucinogenic, and it has no medical purpose. Now, the federal government's position is completely opposite of that of Colorado, of Washington, and actually of 20 states that have medical marijuana laws, plus the District of Columbia. And the banks are saying to the shop owners in Colorado, I can't take your cash because you're selling a product that the federal government says is illegal. And if I take your money without clear bank regulatory guidance on this, we could find ourselves facing huge fines. That's forced these shop owners to deal strictly in currency. So now they're walking around the streets in Colorado with tens of thousands of dollars in paper bags, and they are definitely targets of robbery. As a matter of fact, there has been a cottage industry that's developed in providing security to the shop owners that are there. A lot of ex-military that have formed a couple of different companies that are providing armed services to try to protect the shop owners. But now the shop owners are trying to get their cash into the banking system, and unfortunately they have turned in some instances to the concept of, well, I'll just break up my transactions under $10,000 so that I can deposit the money to the bank, and I'll just open a personal account. The problem with that is that is an offense called structuring. If you intentionally break down transactions in increments under $10,000 for the purposes of evading the filing of a currency transaction report, your money can even come from a legal source. It doesn't matter. That is a felony. And now what the banking industry is unfortunately backing these shop owners into is the possibility that they'll choose that option and expose themselves to criminal prosecutions for structuring violations that are violations of it's actually Title 31 of the U.S. Code. So anyway, those are some of the problems that these shop owners are facing. And now, of course, Washington has the same situation. And we have another situation outside of the United States where in December, the entire nation of Uruguay has now ended prohibition of marijuana. So we have 3 test cases here to see just how this transition with respect to cannabis is going to work or not work in free societies.
When people tell you that, well, if the government is involved in regulating marijuana, it will put the underworld out of business, it will put the cartels out of business, what do you say to that? How do you respond to people who tell you that kind of stuff?
I think that's naive. I think marijuana is it's like going to a restaurant and opening up the menu, and the waiter coming over and saying, "I'm sorry, we've run out of this item." That doesn't mean you're not going to eat. That doesn't mean you're not going to continue to be in business. And it's only one entree on the menu, and that's really what marijuana constitutes for the cartels. The Colombian cartels are extraordinarily heavily involved in cocaine distribution to the Mexican cartels. The Mexican cartels are very, very much involved, not just in cocaine distribution, but also in methamphetamine, massive quantities of methamphetamine being exported from Mexico all over the world. Heroin, pills, there are all types of illegal drugs that these cartels are producing. So taking the marijuana off the menu is not going to make that huge of a difference. And we also need to recognize that these are not just drug cartels. These are transnational criminal organizations. They are involved in all types of crime. And so it's kind of a revolving door for them. You know, if one door happens to close, there's another one that they're going to wind up opening. In Mexico, kidnapping, extortion, stealing of natural resources. These same organizations are involved in those types of things. And these organizations create huge amounts of money that they turn into the most deadly thing they export, which is corruption. You can see it in Mexico in all sectors, in the law enforcement, the military, judicial, and legislative systems. But you see it boiling over the border into the United States. We have more Customs and Border Patrol officers, more immigration officers that have been prosecuted in the last couple of years than in any time before because of the corruption of the cartels of those U.S. personnel. So, no, I don't think that just because we're legalizing marijuana, it's going to make a huge difference for the cartels.
I'll throw another one at you here, Robert. What about people who tell you that, well, we've wasted too much money on the war on drugs and it's a lost effort? What is your response to them when they tell you that?
Well, I guess I hope that those same people aren't working on a cure for cancer or the concept of world peace, because I don't think we can give up on any one of those three. I do think we need to redirect our thinking some in the war on drugs. I think it's extraordinarily important from the enforcement side for us to focus our resources, our very valuable resources, on attacking the command and control of these criminal organizations to disrupt their command and control, because the longer they're in power and the longer that they run these organizations, the more corruption that they can spread around the world. When it comes to the issue of some of the lower-level drug traffickers, I think we have been, unfortunately, guilty of filling our federal prisons with some inmates that are at a very, very low level in the scheme of things. And in some instances, users who turned to street-level transactions for the purposes of feeding their disease. And I think that we really, truly need to focus much more on treatment and education when it comes to the issue of illegal drugs. That's really our problem. As I've been told for decades by major drug traffickers after they've been convicted, and they've said, you know what, there'd be no supply if there was no demand. I never wanted to embrace that as a valid argument. But there's something to be said for that. And we need to look very hard in the mirror at ourselves for being a part of this massive problem that currently exists. And there are definitely elements of our country, our society, that are areas where there's less education, less employment, where we need to catch generations before we lose them. And if we can do something on the demand side more aggressively than we have, not to the extent of taking away our enforcement efforts. I think those are important. But let's just look at this supply. If you're going to put all your resources on trying to stop the supply, the Colombian cartels, it's well reported, in some instances, one having as many as 60 or so semi-submersible submarines. These are submarines that can move 20,000 pounds of whatever they want to move with a crew of 4 to 5 people and can stay semi-submersible for 4 to 5 days. If you've got that much in resources coming, we can't stop it. We can stop 1 or 2, but 60, I'm not so sure that that's going to happen. And so we have to recognize that we're not going to be able to win this war if we're putting all our chips on stopping the supply.
With that said, Robert, isn't the Justice Department spending quite a bit of money on rehabilitation and on trying to get people off of drugs as well? Isn't that part of where the money and resources are going to, or isn't that a substantial amount? Or
last time I looked at the numbers, there was 3 times the amount that was being spent on enforcement as there was on treatment. And, you know, I tend to wonder how they come up with these numbers. But anyway, that was the numbers the last time that I looked at it. So sometimes it's not the number of dollars But do we look at these programs and see just how effectively they're operating? Because clearly there hasn't been a very substantial impact on the demand. The demand has pretty much stayed where it is, if it's not greater. I'm just in awe of the demand for a drug like methamphetamine. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to be able to figure out that after one or two doses of methamphetamine, the majority of the people who are exposed to it have become hooked. And if you've ever seen a picture of a meth user, you couldn't possibly think that that's somewhere you want to go. But for some reason or another, it continues to become a very attractive drug to many different segments of the country. Certainly in Florida, where I'm at, it is a major, major problem. We have methamphetamine dealers, and I know a lot of this because I get involved now that I'm in the consulting business, I do get involved with law firms when they have clients who are seeking to become providers of substantial assistance to the government, providing information in an effort to become a witness against others. And so I debrief these people, and I know what's going on in the streets in my community. And I know what's going on in the streets in a lot of different communities around the United States. And when it comes to methamphetamine, I can tell you that the people that are dealing in that are, for the most part, not well educated, don't really have a lot of income, generally turn to stealing in order to pay for their methamphetamine, oftentimes exchange stolen weapons, stolen tractors, stolen anything they can get their hands on to meth dealers in exchange for methamphetamine, which they in turn then sell for 3 times the value of what it is they turn the meth over to these users for. And that's happening to the tune, I debriefed one individual. There were roughly 100 individuals in a fairly rural area that were involved in that type of activity. So it's a massive problem. And whatever we are doing on the demand side, in my view, isn't very effective.
Well, Robert, on a personal note, our family has little tolerance right now when it comes to people who want to legalize drugs. My wife's grandfather was murdered by 2 guys that were high on pot, and they robbed his store, and they shot him and killed them. So I think for me, I have a tough time having any sympathy for people who believe in legalizing drugs, and I respect their opinion, but my opinions are strong, and I might have a little bias there too. Tell me a little bit about the rise in cartel violence. Could we see that in Colorado due to legalized pot?
Yeah, there's no doubt. This is a group of individuals that have been, up until this point in time, estimates are generating about $1 billion a year in income. So anytime somebody comes in and begins to take over your business, and you're losing that kind of revenue, and you're also so exposed, I really am concerned about the potential for violence against the legal shop owners that are there, not just because they've taken over a business that was so lucrative to the cartel, and there is a cartel clearly, the Sinaloa cartel and and one of the other cartels that when I last looked had a number of individuals that had been prosecuted in that area that clearly were connected to those Mexican cartels. But now you've got these people also because of their challenges dealing with the legal banking systems, walking around with huge amounts of cash. So I think that I think that there's potentially going to be some violence, going to be a lot of thefts. I think that there's also going to be a black market that is going to evolve in Colorado, and the reason is that there are a limited number of legal shops and a limited amount of marijuana and a huge amount of population that are seeking to obtain that marijuana from those shops, which has caused the pricing to go out the roof and cause it to be way above what the pricing would be for the illegal marijuana distributors. So there's going to be, unfortunately, I'm sure, a desire amongst the consumers who otherwise would have to pay substantially more going to a legal shop to simply go back to the illegal sources that they were dealing with before that. And, of course, once they're caught with a personal consumption amount of marijuana, how is anyone going to be able to determine where they got it from, whether they got it from a legal shop or they didn't get it from a legal shop? So it's going to be very interesting and something that we need to look very closely at, because these tests in Colorado, in Washington, and then in South America, you have an entire nation, Uruguay, which just in December ended all prohibition with respect to marijuana. So there are places that we now will be able to look at and no longer give a theory about whether or not the legalization of marijuana is going to have this effect or that effect. It's going to be very easy to be able to see with these jurisdictions now legalizing.
With what you're talking about, it sounds like there's going to be big challenges for law enforcement. What do they have to look for? What are they up against?
Well, there's a real confusion in law enforcement on this issue too, because I go to retirement parties every now and then, and just happened to be to one last week with one of my colleagues that I'd worked with for years, and so I get to talk to the new blood that's out there. And when it comes to our law enforcement community, we've got to recognize they've got a very, very limited amount. They've got far less of the resources that they wish that they had in order to truly serve the public and keep us all safe. And now we're putting them in a position where we've got marijuana legalized, and yet we may have some individuals that are going to deal in black market marijuana, but when you get into proving the cases, are you going to want to get bogged down into whether or not that particular possession was legal, wasn't legal, or are you going to focus on the cases that are clear-cut in dealing with the other drugs in the community and the other crimes that are dealt with in the community? So I think that there's a frustration and a tendency to shy away from even devoting resources in the marijuana cases because of the current state of confusion with regard to marijuana. I say confusion because the federal government today still says that marijuana is a Schedule I drug, meaning it is hallucinogenic, it's addictive, and it also has no medical purpose. Yet 20 states and the District of Columbia have said that they've passed medical marijuana laws. Well, somebody's got to be right, and those are two diametrically opposed positions. So there's so much confusion in the cannabis area that I think law enforcement probably is best served by trying to use those resources in other areas until we can get a handle on reconciling the federal position and the state position. They are diametrically opposed. And when it comes to the issue of legalization of drugs, for what it's worth, in my book, I cannot fathom a society that would want to unleash drugs like methamphetamine, crack cocaine, heroin on their population and make it legally available for them to be able to use. The destruction that comes to our citizens as a result of drug abuse is horrific, and you know that firsthand. And we're not doing anybody any favors, in my view, to legalize that. I think we have to continue to fight this, and we have to continue to fight it, though I think in a little bit a different manner than we have in the recent past.
Well, Robert, I think you're doing a valuable service here because you're providing a lot of information that people might have never heard before. They have always heard the arguments on the other side about legalization, and in my opinion, I'm not hearing enough of that. You have to, if you want to find the other side, you have to Google it and look at some think tank who has written an article or something. You're not hearing that in the national conversation, and it needs to be heard.
Yeah, and there have been, it's so confusing here for the public, I think, and for me at times. You look at some of the studies, there was a global commission on drug policy that had some very, very well-respected people on it. This was a paper that came out in 2011 by a 19-member commission. We had on that former U.S. Treasury Secretary George Shultz, Kofi Annan, former UN Secretary. There were the former presidents of several countries, and unfortunately, their position was they thought that it was time to end criminalization of drug use. Of course, they're not talking about legalizing drug trafficking. They're talking about decriminalizing the personal use side of it and offering enhanced health treatment and education services. I mean, you have position papers like that, and then on the other side, the reality is that, in my view, that opening the gate to the illegal drugs is going to create chaos. And if it's anywhere that you really want to go to, there better be a huge investment in education and treatment before you ever contemplate that, because we have an uninformed youth that considers themselves to be completely
bunch of know-it-alls, right?
they're not going to have a problem from anything in their life. They are bulletproof, and they don't realize what they're dealing with. And we really need to go and provide some better quality of education and treatment in this area. It's the only way that I see, in my view, that we can get the demand side down. We have to work as hard on the demand side, if not harder, than we do on the supply.
Robert Mazur, DEA undercover agent, author of the book The Infiltrator, My Secret Life Inside the Dirty Banks Behind Pablo Escobar's Medellin Cartel. Robert, before I let you go, tell me a little bit about your website and what can we find on there, and can we purchase your book there as well?
Yes, you can go to the-infiltrator.com. That's the-infiltrator.com, and you'll find all sorts of information there about the book, about the development of a movie from the book, reviews about it. There's also a where to buy tab, and if you click on that, it'll give you the direct links to major booksellers like Amazon and others where you can buy the book.
Robert Mazur, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for stopping by, my friend.
It's a privilege. Thank you.